Hello, friends. My name is Adam, and I'm on a quest to be the most prolific reviewer of all time. And I just finished watching this interesting documentary about Paul McCartney after he left the Beatles called Man on the Run. And I kind of understand why they wanted to focus on that particular aspect of his life because mostly when you think about Paul McCartney, you think about his time in the Beatles, and that's the same for all of them, like John and George and Ringo. But it's a very interesting question. Like, what do you do after you have achieved the pinnacle that you could possibly do in your career? And he decided that he wanted to be in a band with his wife. And I think that he had kind of an innocent feeling about that. Like, oh, I can be in a band with whoever I want, and I want to be in a band with my wife. But I think that he was a little bit naive about how famous the Beatles were. And he wanted this band to be like the Beatles, so each member would be as famous as he was. But I don't know. I think even the band that we're talking about is called Wings. And I don't know if anybody is a super huge fan of Wings, but I think you can be not a super huge fan of the Beatles and know who they are. Maybe not like people like my daughter's age or my son's age, but people my age and older definitely know who the Beatles are without being fans of them. So I think that was a little bit naive because Paul McCartney and John Lennon had this like really unique and special relationship, very charismatic and creative, and they ended up being together with two other very talented musicians. So I think that the musicians that made up Wings, apart from Linda, because that's a special case, she's not really a musician, although I think she did an okay job, but that was a lot of pressure to put her under. But those musicians are not at the level of George and Ringo and John. They're just not, because that is one of the best bands of all time. So it's like you get constantly criticized for doing something different. And I think it's an interesting moment in his life because he wanted to prove that he could be successful without the Beatles, and he created this band to be successful without the Beatles. And it's true, he was quite successful. Like Mullen Kintyre is the biggest single in British history. I don't know if until now it's the biggest single in British history, but it was up until that point bigger than anything that he had done with the Beatles. And that's just a crazy, like, I remember playing that song in my guitar lessons and thinking, what is this? you know, my guitar teacher was like, this is a Beatles song. This is a McCartney song. I'm like, I don't know what this is. But yeah, I think he, and so it's bookended by the documentary focuses on him leaving the Beatles, but as he said, John decided to leave first, but it was more public that he was the one who left. And because of this weird contract that they had signed at Apple, every kind of creative endeavor that he would do would belong to Apple. And he really thought that Alan Klein was, who was the manager of the Beatles at the time, and that was John Lennon's idea. He thought that Alan Klein was scummy and a scammer, which he turned out to be correct about. But he basically went to court to become independent of the Beatles. And the other Beatles were like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Why? We have this great thing But later, John would admit that his pick was actually a scam artist and was stealing from them. So Paul ended up being correct and they kind of mended ways. But anyway, so Paul creates this band and then he puts them on tour and they are very successful, like Band on the Run, Live and Let Die. They did have hits, maybe not as big, apart from All of Kintyre, that maybe not as big as the Beatles, but they had huge hits for sure. But the thing, and then the documentary ends with two things. One, the death of John Lennon from assassination, and his arrest in Japan for having pot. And he says an interesting thing like, oh, sometimes you just realize that you're an idiot, and I was being an idiot. And he's kind of right, right? Because he, earlier, they hadn't been able to go to Japan because he had been charged in English court with possession of marijuana. So he couldn't even enter the country because of that. And then he decided to bring marijuana to Japan. Like, maybe he forgot that it was there, but like, I've never understood people who just take drugs from one country to another country. That's very odd. But anyway, so he gets arrested and he spends 7 days in a Japanese prison and he thinks to himself, what do I want to do with my life? I don't want to do this touring anymore because it's crazy. I want to sit in my farm and smoke marijuana if I want to. I mean, he didn't say that, but I think it was heavily implied. So he gets out of prison and then he decides, maybe not officially, but he's basically like, Wings is not going to tour anymore. I don't want to tour anymore, which is fair enough because the Beatles had stopped touring because it was just not worth it anymore. They couldn't recreate the sound due to technical limitations, and plus the Beatles tours were getting wilder and wilder. So if you have somebody like Paul McCartney who had been touring since he was 18, and I think this would be he was in his 30s, late 30s when Wings broke up. So basically, most of his life he spent touring, so I can kind of understand why he wouldn't want to do it anymore. And then later, he was touring again. But of course, the other bookend, the death of John Lennon, I think it shocked him and it shocked the other Beatles. And the thing that I was surprised by, because everybody knows that John Lennon was assassinated, but I don't think most people know that George Harrison also almost got assassinated. He was like attacked in his home and he nearly died as well. So it wasn't at the same time, it was much later, but Paul McCartney was basically like, yeah, we can't be traveling with no security anymore because there's crazy people out there. So just being so famous puts you in a lot of risk, I would say. So it's an interesting documentary, and I think that he was involved in it, so it does have a lot of great music in it. And visually, especially in the beginning of the documentary, the way that they show the progression of the time with cuts from different still, like they do this one thing where they show him like, because they're talking about Wings, right? But you need all of the information about him before. So there's like a picture of him as a baby, picture of him with John when they were in high school, picture of them in the cavern, picture of them, doing different Beatles things, and then to the Wings era. So it's really well done. But I think the thing that's lacking, I would say, is if you want to tell the story of Paul McCartney after the Beatles, Wings is just this very small part of it. So I think you should also talk about his life after Wings, because Wings ended in 1980 and it's 2024. So that is like a long time to not be doing Wings. And, he had like a kind of like, want to talk about what happened with Michael Jackson? Like, come on. So basically, he becomes friends with Michael Jackson, and Michael Jackson buys the Beatles catalogs because they had this conversation, and Paul McCartney feels, rightfully so, feels betrayed because he had been telling Michael Jackson that he was trying to raise funds to buy the Beatles catalog back. So that's an interesting story. And I think, like, it's kind of weird because it's one movie. And they did a documentary recently called Get Back, where I think that there was 4 or 5 episodes, and it was all just about the Get Back sessions. So why not do like 10 episodes on Paul McCartney after the Beatles? That would be great. You know, maybe even 10 episodes on every Beatle after the Beatles. What happened? I mean, it would be kind of short for John, unfortunately, but the other three, you know, kind of be interesting. All right, so I liked it, but then again, I'm kind of a fan of the Beatles. I like their music, I like their individual personalities, and I like that they're complicated. I know, like, there's been a backlash against John Lennon because of his he admitting the fact that he abused women in his life, but he admitted it, right? And he said that he was trying to change. So, not that that excuses anything, but I think you can't permanently cancel a person who's trying to be better, you know. All right, but what do you think? What do you think about John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, George Harrison, the Beatles, Wings, whatever? Put your thoughts in the comment section. If you like what I do, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow me on Spotify. I'm trying to get to 800 subscribers by the end of March, and I think we're at 740. So it's possible. All right, thank you, everybody. Bye bye.